Beautiful, beautiful. So that's all I'm going to say today about competitive equilibrium in a single labor market. What I'd like to do with a little bit of the remaining time is to think a little bit about how to attack problems where labor supply or labor demand in one labor market depends on wages and employment in a different labor market. Right? So we can think about this, for example, if we want to think about different cities. We can ask, how does a change in the wage in one city affect labor supply and labor demand in a neighboring city, right? Where people might be able to move from one city to the other. Or we could ask questions about different types of workers, right? How does the market for doctors affect the market for nurses and vice versa? Or how does the market for native-born American workers interact with the market for foreign-born American workers, right? We can also think about interactions between different regulatory regimes. If I put a regulation on one labor market, like a minimum wage, how does that affect a different labor market that isn't influenced by the minimum wage? Right, if we think about the minimum wage as only affecting formal work, right, legal work, how does the minimum wage affect the number of workers and their wages in an informal sector that isn't covered by the minimum wage, right, or an entrepreneurial sector? Cool, so enough babbling about it, let's do this. So to start out, I want to think about the geographical question, right? In other words, let's say that we've got labor supply linked across different cities. So we could think about, for example, having a labor market in Los Angeles with labor demand, Los Angeles and the wage, right, labor supply, and a labor market in, let's say, Riverside, right? Or the Inland Empire, right? So kind of the interior California part of Los Angeles, area near Los Angeles. We can again have labor demand, right, in Riverside, labor supply in Riverside. And let's imagine that at first, at least, because Los Angeles and Riverside are really connected to each other, right, they're part of the same metropolitan area, it's easy to move from one to the other. Let's imagine that we've got an initial equilibrium wage that's identical between the two cities. Make sense? We'll forget about cost of living, right? Of course, this is a little weird in this case. Now, as we talked about when we talked about automation, right, the development of computers really reduced employment for routine-heavy occupations, and it increased employment for manual occupations. It just so happens that the LA economy had in the 1980s a much larger share of manufacturing and other routine employment than did the Riverside economy, which was very heavily agricultural and logistical, right? Shipping and trucking and stuff like this that actually saw increased employment as a consequence of computerization. So for a simple version of this, let's imagine that in the 1980s, as a result of this technological change, we saw a decline in the demand for labor in Los Angeles, and no change at all in supply or demand of labor for labor in Riverside. How do we expect this to play out, right? How do we expect this to affect wages in these two cities? Well, of course, the first thing we're going to see is that as a consequence of this decline in wage, right, we're going to have a new equilibrium wage in LA that's lower. We're also going to have fewer people working in Los Angeles than we did before. Make sense? And if these two markets were linked, that would be the end of the story. What we might expect is that some people who used to work in LA are going to be willing to work in Riverside for a sufficiently high wage, right? For some people, that the cost that it'll take them to shift to working in Riverside is almost zero, right? For other people, they might need a little bit of a wage boost. But if we imagine that some people are going to react to this difference between LA wages and Riverside wages by moving to Riverside, how is that going to affect supply of labor in LA? How is it going to affect supply of labor in Riverside? Well, in LA, we're going to have people leave, right? People are going to take off. When people leave the city of LA, labor supply is going to fall, right, after the move, which is, of course, going to bring wages up a little bit. And in Riverside, all these new people entering the Riverside labor market are going to cause labor supply to rise. right? There's going to be more people available to work at a given wage than there was before. What's the consequence of that going to be? It's going to be lower wages in Riverside a little bit. Right? So in our final equilibrium, this shock to labor demand just in Los Angeles is going to end up influencing Los Angeles wages and Riverside wages, rather than just influencing Los Angeles wages. The effect on wages in LA is going to be a little bit smaller than it would have been if people hadn't been willing to move from LA to Riverside, right? And of course, the effect in Riverside is going to be larger than it would have been if there wasn't this linkage. A couple things I want to point out about this. The first thing is going to be that the final difference in wages, right, I'll call wage final in Riverside versus wage final in LA, this final difference in wages is essentially going to represent the value to the marginal worker in LA of being in LA rather than Riverside. Right? We can think of this as something like the length of commute it would take to move into the Inland Empire, or the value that this last person places on being close to their family. So I want you to think for a second, based on this model, if we end up with lower average wages in LA than Riverside, as a result of this change, is the marginal worker more productive in LA or in Riverside? Or is it the same? So I'm going to argue that the marginal worker, right, the last worker here, is actually producing more valuable stuff in Riverside than the last worker working in LA. The reason we know that, right, is because wage equals marginal revenue product for labor demanders, right? So the fact that someone's willing to pay this person a higher wage in Riverside than they are in LA means that that worker is more valuable in Riverside than they are in LA. However, this does not imply that we could make the economy as a whole or society as a whole better off by moving more people from LA to Riverside, because of the fact that this wage difference represents the value to the LA worker of being in LA, right? So if there's no barriers to allowing these markets to freely adjust, right, if we have all of the conditions for competitive equilibrium satisfied, we should expect that this wage difference is essentially going to be set by market forces at the right level, so that everyone who values moving to, values living in LA less than the economy values their increased productivity in Riverside will move, and everyone who values it less is going to stay in LA, right? So our optimal societal outcome is going to be that the number of people who stay in LA, right, this number of people work in LA, and this number of people work in Riverside. Okay. One last thing that I want to point out, then I'm going to really stop pontificating about this, is that if we tried to do, imagine if we tried to do something like a difference in difference to find out the effect of automation on wages in Los Angeles. And we were very clever, and we thought, Riverside is right there. It's kind of similar, not that similar, right? But let's use Riverside as a control group, right? Let's compare the change in wages in LA after automation to the change in wages in Riverside after automation. This would be a horrible strategy. This would be a nightmare, right? Because the change that affected LA also affected Riverside, right? These two are linked together. Okay, last thing I'm going to say about that. Okay, we're now completely out of time, so I'm going to have to leave thinking about linkages between different occupations for another moment, possibly for an exercise we'll do in class together. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this material once we get together on Zoom.